We can get started.
Right. Just for Frank, here we are. Um,
And me.
that's right. You weren't present for the previous
Yes.
iterations of this. Just other stand-ins were there.
Yes.
Well, all right. So I've got some slides to go along with this just to keep me on track. The point is that the associate deans have, as of yesterday, submitted to governance a revised intellectual integrity, academic integrity policy. I want to talk about some of the salient points of that, why, what matters to faculty, how your responsibilities have or haven't changed. Um, and these were the sort of guiding points. You two know why reporting matters, so I'm not even going to bother with it. The one of the most substantive things is not in the policy, but it's in uh, the way that we're hoping that people will report. And previously, we had reported using Maxient, which is really a student affairs database, and we've moved away from that in part because it's a student affairs tool, really, but to a large extent, we're using Starfish now, and it's because it's easier. If you go into Starfish, you don't have to worry about uh, putting in a bunch of student information. It's all in there. So the ease on the reporting in for the instructor is what we were most interested in. Um, the reporting process, 4 easy pieces. These really, and it may be that they've changed relative to what's written in the policy now. What we have done in the policy is try to remove procedure from it. We've made the policy just a policy document, and we have put the procedures offline because they changed based on different things that are potentially short-lived. But this process should be consistent. You should be consulting with students. Um, Giving the student an opportunity to speak their piece. Okay, if you caught them red-handed with a cheat sheet in a sit-down exam, fine. You don't need to belabor that. But if it's a plagiarism case, if it's something where you think that they used AI in something, all of those situations should have a student consultation involved in it and give them an opportunity to explain their side of things, um, or dream up something or whatever, but also to give you an opportunity to express to them the fact that this is something you take seriously. At this point, you shouldn't be talking about penalties. It should just be a conversation about what happened. You can talk about potential penalties, but it shouldn't be that you've decided this at this point. It is good, although not necessarily required, that you talk to your department chair or program director if for no reason other than if it comes to an appeal, they're going to want to not be blindsided by it. So, um, especially if you're a junior faculty member, it makes sense to talk to your chair. But even for a senior person, let your chair know that, hey, this is something that may be coming your way at some point. Uh, Once a penalty is determined, you actually have to communicate that to the student. Sometimes this gets missed. Yeah, it's important to have that in writing. And then submitting the report to Starfish. So we have, of course, all used Starfish at this point. So we're veteran in it. When you go to Starfish and you click on your individual student, in the top left, you'll have the option to raise a flag. And when you raise that flag, the first thing that comes up is academic integrity violation. And when you click on that, you just have two things that you need to do. One is that you need to put the course context. This is in cases where you have a student who's in multiple courses of yours. Um, but you've got to write a comment. And the comment doesn't need to be a book. In fact, we really don't want it to be a book. We don't want it to be anything that is taking a huge amount of your time. What we want in that box is what happened in broad strokes. It could be a couple sentences. It's fine. Something about what the assignment was in which the offense took place. Are we talking about a final exam? Are we talking about a discussion post? What was it? Uh, Presuming that you talk to the student, we want to know whether they acknowledged any responsibility. And that can be a significant thing in terms of next steps. It would be good if you could put in what the general penalty is. Reduced uh, reduced grade on the assignment, failing grade in the course, no penalty, whatever. And if you've discussed it with your associate dean, it can be good to mention that. The starfish flag won't be seen by anyone. It won't be seen. It'll be seen by someone. It won't be seen by the student. It'll be seen by all of the associate deans. So that is good in terms of our attempts to try to rein in serial offenders. So if someone is doing something in a history course, but they've also done something in that management course, previously those individual associate deans wouldn't necessarily know that the student has done this. Now everyone knows immediately, everyone who has a institutional role. Remember that you don't have to uh, this doesn't need to incur a penalty, that you can write, no penalty was assigned. I agreed with the student that they would do this instead. Um, Reporting is important just to make sure that if a student is going to do this again, that we can then come down on them like a ton of bricks. The integrity policy, the main changes were the removing of procedural elements to a separate offline source and removing the role of student conduct. We talked extensively with student conduct, and they really don't want to be in the business of dealing with academic affairs, with grades and stuff like that. So the old thing with, do you want student conduct to be involved in this, or is this a student conduct penalty? There's none of that. As an instructor, you can enforce an academic penalty. If there is more to be done, the associate deans will deal with that. All you have to do is what's going on in your course, and don't worry about the rest of it. The rest of it might include the dreaded XE grade. Um, Again, you don't have to deal with that. The XE grade is something that the associate deans are going to look at the individual penalties and say, this is egregious, a failing grade in the course isn't enough for this. Or they're going to say, this offense in and of itself isn't terrible, but this is the third time the student has done something like this. We need to do something more. And the XE grade is one of the things that we can do that it is a mark on their transcript that they then have to jump through some hoops in order to get it off of their transcript. And anyone who looks at that transcript is going to see XE and see in the definition that this is a failing grade due to integrity violation. Um, I, oh yeah, the XE grade, there's a statement about it in the undergraduate catalog. We are hoping to modify the second part of that, the second paragraph, to say that an XE designation can only be applied by student conduct in consultation with the academic associate deans. This is what we talked with Brandon in student conduct about. He's happy with that. We're happy with that. Again, either way, for the instructor, you can certainly talk to us about, hey, I think you should throw the book at this student, but ultimately it's not anything that you have to worry about. I'd like you to throw the book at this student, but I don't want to have to do any more paperwork on it. You won't. I'm not going to get into this fourth dangerous bullet here because there's plenty to talk about that would take up more time than we have available. I hope that everyone is putting into their syllabus something about your expectation as an instructor in this course about generative AI use, that you're talking with students about this, that you're taking it seriously. It's a big one. You all know us, so I will finish up and ask the masses in attendance what questions they have.
All right, I think I'll start. I first of all, I've never heard of XC grades. How long have you guys been using them?
So the XE grade came into existence with the previous uh, policy revision, and it was it was an important step, but it's something that really hasn't been used, which is a good thing because it means that there haven't been students who have done the terrible level of things. I think Rebecca may be the first person to have an XE grade uh, in a graduate course
Oh,
this past
God,
semester. Yeah,
graduate level. That's
yeah,
Yes.
it was very deserving. Let's just
oof.
say.
Wow.
Um, well, then my second question, I mentioned this to Paul before. So last semester, I only taught lower division courses, and all the writing was in class. So it was pretty easy to monitor these kinds of things. This semester, I'm teaching two upper division courses, and I haven't taught these courses in a while, and they're very heavy writing components to them, and I'm really kind of worried about AI. And yeah, I'm one of these people. I don't really have a problem with Grammarly and things like that, I guess. But I'm I do come up with questions that are very specific, and I do require citations from various areas of books. So it's more difficult to kind of just throw it in the, some AI program. But I guess
Yeah,
if I know you can't in your capacity reveal things, but in general terms, can you mention sort of how you've seen maybe questions of AI come to your level about, writing samples and generally how do they play out in terms of, because there really probably is no smoking gun kind of thing. I mean, it's,
yeah,
how do you,
yeah,
how does that look, I guess, at your level?
yeah. I agree that it's the fact that there is no current smoking gun in many cases is a problem. Okay, the students who aren't good at cheating will continue to use the free version of ChatGPT and do dumb things like include the statement that says, "Well, I'm just an AI generator, but I think," you know,
Right.
that that's great because that's the smoking gun. But the student who's smarter or who has the pay version of ChatGPT or whatever else, it's not something that a AI checker is going to help you with. And I I have had a number of violation reports come in that say this scored 100% on ChatGPT 0, and that doesn't do it. Um, there are people who are far too hawkish on this at this point, and they think that they can use the well, this assignment doesn't sound like the student, and
Hmm.
I I think that that sets us up for a really difficult to defend decision, and it ultimately is going to be challenged by a student who, whether they used AI or not, are going to be able to defend themselves that you can't prove this. And when you ask me about the subject, I'm able to respond lucidly about it. So, it's one thing to set a student down and say, okay, I'm going to ask you some questions about the tariff of 1871. And, if clearly if they know nothing about it, that gives you some entree into okay, why don't you just level with me? But if they can talk the talk, I don't see that we can throw penalties around like that, especially if it's something that's going to, fail a student in a course that's required in their major. And, so that is basically costing them money at that point if it's extending the clock to completion. So I'm hoping that instructors will be careful with this, but that they won't turn a blind eye and just say, well, I'm never going to be able to prove this, so um, I'm not going to do anything about it. It's okay to have the conversation with the student. There's nothing that says that you can't have the conversation and express your concerns about it and say what you're going to do as a consequence of this. And you can put in a violation report with no penalty and say, I'm putting this in because my concerns have reached a point that I think that it's, I think it means something. And the student's going to be potentially pissed off about that. But when there's no penalty, I, from the associate dean standpoint, I think we're in a lot safer position to say, this, as long as you live a pure and true life after this, nothing worse is going to happen to you. But if we continue to see this in other classes, then yeah, there could be consequences. So
Frank,
I
I
don't
would
know.
just,
Go ahead, Carol.
I was just going to say, Frank, one of the areas that we have supported instructors on is around citations also. And so when the assignment description is written in such a way that students are supposed to use certain certain resources or certain sources, and the student submits work that has false citations, then that's what you talk to the student about, right? Because they didn't cite the paper or didn't cite the resources or the sources correctly. And that's why there's a penalty, whether it's a reduced grade or redoing the assignment or whatever it might be. So it's those sorts of things that we've supported our instructors in, like writing really, for lack of a better word, tight assignment descriptions with parameters that are pretty specific to your course and not generic. And then also being clear in the syllabus on what sort of AI is appropriate for using. Like Grammarly is okay to use for grammar support or spell checkers, those sorts of things. But sentence structure, sentence formation, those things are not okay to use AI for. And so that's why we're encouraging that everybody has some sort of statement in their syllabus around AI that makes sense for your course.
That jives with my approach. So I'm glad to hear I'm not out of line. I mean, am I also, I mean, I think you said this already, but I think John Kane has said this multiple times, that the software to detect AI is not very effective. It's pretty flawed, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, all right. Thank you. I didn't even know, in fact, that we were supposed to report through Starfish. So this was helpful for me just on that alone.
Yeah.
I've
And
not reported anyone in a while. Fortunately, I haven't had too many cases. So
Yeah. No, the Starfish really should help. It really should make things easier for reporting. And as you know, the reporting itself can be a pain, and certainly the follow-up from it with the student begging to, whatever is really the bigger concern. But if and we can't do anything about that, but we can do something about the reporting part. So if that is made easier, hopefully that's at least some contribution to getting people to report.
yeah, no, that makes sense to me. So thank you. I appreciate that. And once again, I mentioned this to Paul yesterday. I appreciate the provost sending out the AI examples. That's helpful too,
Yeah.
particularly those of us who are old and don't know these things. So thank you. I won't waste any more of your time. So
I had a question. Do we know, or do you all know about the committee that is charged by the provost for creating the AI policy and where that's at?
Carol, would you like to answer that?
Yes, I think that it's a work in progress, and I think that there's a lot of they're taking time to get the perspectives and voices of we have a lot of different groups on campus who are working on AI in different sort of nuggets of it. And so it's sort of bringing that all together, and ultimately it'll be the provost who will kind of combine that information. But I think you're referring to CACI, the Council on
Yeah,
Academic
like
Quality and
another,
Integrity.
yeah.
So they did
isn't Lisa Glidden on that?
When I went to the meeting, Lisa was not there,
Okay.
but
Doug Hemfield's the chair of it, right?
Doug
Yeah.
is the chair.
Yeah.
Stephanie Pritchard is a part of it. There's some people from the advisement center on that, I think. I don't know how active that council has been, but I know that they have been doing work on AI and suggested some things to the provost, and that's where the provost then generated those samples that he sent out, or the
Oh.
exemplars that he sent out to the faculty. So I think that they're working and they're continuing to work, and it's a
Yeah.
complicated process, right? I mean, it's not, it's complicated. It's not
Yeah.
straightforward, and it's hard to
Right.
have, because it's so changing, it's hard to have a statement that also changes, right?
Exactly.
Or to have a
Right.
policy that also changes. And it's also about how instructors use AI, you know?
Right.
So there's just so many pieces to it.
I won't mention the person's name because they shared it with me. I think they might have shared it with me in confidence per my role in UUP, but there was a pretty long document or somewhat long document where a faculty member lists their reservations about the AI policy. I don't know if that person has shared it with you. You could probably all guess who it might be on campus, someone who's very outspoken about such matters, but it was kind of interesting to read. So I look forward to hearing the debate as they come together.
Yeah,
Sure, and I think those are legitimate concerns, you
Yeah.
know, about when we consider the inclusiveness of some of the AI and DEI initiatives, and just as a campus, what our vision is, right, and what our central focus is. You know, I think those are important pieces to the discussion, and that's why it's hard to come up with one. It's just very complex. It's hard to come up with one policy, one statement, one way that we're all going to do it in every class, in every department, and everything we do. So
yeah, suffice to say, Frank, that you haven't heard the last.
So sure. Well, you guys, I know you have a challenging job, so thank you for your work. I will see you guys all around campus. Have a good, I guess, beginning of the semester.
You
you
too, Frank.
too.
And Jessica, I might see you later.
Yes, you probably will.